I'm really honored to be invited to this. I can assure you there's no organization in Ontario that I hold in higher regard than OSCIA, and that's a relationship that's gone back a long time. How do I advance that? Right there. So 75 years, and I started to add them up, and it's more than 50 I know that I've been involved in this organization, because it was the summer of 1964 that I worked with a summer assistant with Don Hill and Harvey Wright, and doing a lot on OSCIA projects. And I thought that was a fairly long time till I talked to my wife Dot, and she talked about her father-in-law Joe French in Perth County was active in projects on this back in the early 40s. So between the Daynards and the French, we've been around pretty well for all of that 75 years. And we've got a fabulous record of achievement on all kinds of different things. And I'm not going to go into any of that in economy of time. I did want to comment on one of the things that I think this organization understands better than anybody, pretty much, is the value of incremental improvement. Sure, everybody likes to talk about the big things we do, the hybrid corn, the chemical weed control, biotechnology, GPS, and things along that line. But most of the gains that we've made in crop improvement and soil improvement are little things, incremental, small changes that add up. And this year we grew about 160 bushel average of corn. I remember when it was about 40, and most of that didn't happen in big leaps. It happened in small changes, modifying things, exactly the sort of stuff you guys folks are specialized in. And you do have a fabulous track record of environmental leadership. And I could talk all day about that, but I did want to talk about this one in particular, environmental farm plans. I was involved with that, with Ag Care and Ontario Corn Producers Association at the time. And there were quite a few farm groups that were involved in trying to pull this together. Give special credit to Roger George, who was president of the OFA at the time, that major lead on that. But when it come down to actually talking about who was going to do it, it turned it over to OSCIA, and they've got 20 plus years of incredible success on this thing. It's a global first, global significant. Harold tells me when he checks around the world, people still in awe at how you've achieved that high level of participation. It's a basis for all kinds of stewardship for programs. In fact, if I had to fault it, I would say it's because it's too successful. It's been so successful that probably as Ontario farmers, we've been tempted to spend time patting ourselves on the back on how great this program is, rather than realizing that we have to move on. But we have to move on now, and the issue is sustainability, probably coupled fairly closely with the issue of accountability as well. And that's what you've asked me to talk about. The question is, where did this word start? Sustainability. I don't think that was in the vocabulary when I was in public school or high school. As near as I can find out, it started with a Bruntland Commission. Bruntland Commission, actually that's an informal name. It's got a long name for the United Nations that I can't remember. But they came out with a pretty impressive report. Bruntland was the Prime Minister, or former Prime Minister of Norway, and basically came out with a definition. It's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising future generations. And quite frankly, that's something that made eminently good sense now, and makes really good then and made good sense now. There's some other things about that. I'm sure you've all seen that one. Some other things that don't talked about too much, or that are in that report as well, are the need to recognize the need of the world's poor, and to talk about the limitations and the opportunities of technology. That last point has caused some confusion, because some people interpret that to mean technology is bad. It needs solutions that don't involve high technology. And others, like myself, say that means you can't solve everything with technology, but there's a lot of things that you can do as well. Problem is, after that it came out in 1987. That report incidentally applied to a lot of things beyond agriculture, but in agriculture it was almost picked up immediately by people latching onto that technology part and using this to say that technology was bad, and they developed a definition of sustainability. This one, I'm not picking on the National Geographic. It just happens when I went into Google to find an example to make my case, this was the easiest one to find. But this is very typical of what you can find on literally millions of websites around the world, what sustainable agriculture is. But it's basically a rejection of industrial approach to food production. It's organic, it's free range, it's low input, holistic, whatever that means, biodynamic, whatever that means. It's basically probably everything that you folks in this room don't do or along that line. And I think that's the reason why mainstream agriculture, including me, turned off on this. I was aware of this word all the time I was with the corn producers. Basically say that's not us. It's something that makes sense on a niche scale, but not for feeding the world's population. And we tend to ignore it. But we can't ignore it any longer because there's some major things that happens. Somewhere over the last 5 years, the giants in the world's food business have picked up, for whatever reasons, for various reasons, that this sustainability is something that's really important to them. And they're in the process of moving remarkably quickly to develop standards for sustainable agriculture. Now, you can say they're being driven by whatever reason. They're being driven by activists to some degree. They're being driven by the public and consumers concerned for the environment. They're being driven, obviously, by means of goals of trying to improve their image, and they're probably being driven by some people around the corporate table that really want to do the right thing and are hearing the same message as everybody else. But so this moving ahead, and unfortunately, in many cases, it's not coming from the agriculture community, farm community that's driving this. It's coming from the food industry. It started in Europe. Unilever and Nestle seem to be the two that are given the major credit for moving in this direction. Both global giants. Unilever, it represents about 10% of the whole world vegetable business. Nestle's is huge to know and is a French company. And some major food retailers, particularly from Germany and the Netherlands. But it's becoming global. And one of the key players that's driving it on this side of the ocean is Walmart, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. So there are all kinds of different schemes that are out there for certifying, attempting to certify as to what's certifiable or sustainable agriculture. And I just picked this one up as just one example. This organization used to be called Europe GAP. It's now called Global GAP, based in Germany. GAP basically standing for Good Agricultural Practices. Global represents a desire to go global. And these are some of the major food companies that are buying into that. And I suspect mostly you can't read what's on there, but you'll recognize a few giants. Ahold, I believe, is Dutch, a food giant. Marks and Spencer is on there. But you see at the bottom, Tesco's on there, Tengelmann from Germany, and so on. And that's some of the retailers that have said that this is important. And these are a few of the suppliers to them. And I put that on, not that I'm expecting anybody to memorize everything that's on there, or even to be able to read it. To give you some appreciation, this isn't Mickey Mouse stuff. This is some major things that are going on. Again, this is driven primarily in Europe, but it's moving across the Atlantic. There's some other major initiatives. There's one, again, headed in Europe called Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, attempting to define what's sustainable, setting some standards for that. Unilever is credited as being the major mover on that one. On our side of the Atlantic, Walmart has developed its own consortium, Sustainability Consortium. I didn't give you the who's who on that, but if you think of any major player at all that's in this, Campbell Soup, General Mills, any of these people, that's who's in the Sustainability Consortium. But there's some others. There's one in Europe, International Sustainability and Carbon Certification. In order for any vegetable oil or grain to be used for biofuels in Europe, it has to be certified that it comes from a sustainable source, and there's all kinds of protocols they have to go through on that. and this ISCC certification. The only place that I know that that's spread across ours is anybody who's selling vegetable oil from here into Europe to go to biofuels has to go through that certification. So in fact, some canola is going through that in Western Canada. This last one I hadn't even heard of, ICEAL Alliance, which is a coalition of coalitions, the Rainforest Alliance, one on palm oil. Nick Betts from used to be with you folks, now with the Grain Farmers of Ontario, and I'll talk about Nick a little bit more because of where he's going on this. And he says that that's the one to watch that's going to have the major influence at all of setting these standards. So we've got others. The soybean industry is within the grains and oilseed sector that we're involved, corn, soybeans, wheat, barley, oats, things like that. The soybean one seems to be the first developed major pressure, partly because they're being driven by palm oil. And palm oil, quite frankly, is being driven by concerns of cutting down forests in Malaysia and places like that, and labor. And you could say, why does that affect us? It does, because they've decided, the Unilevers of the world decide whatever we're going to do for palm oil, we're going to do for canola and soybeans. And so the Grain Farmers of Ontario are very much part of this RTRS, as they call it, trying to set up. And again, this is an attempt by the farm community to have some. So there's organic certification programs. There's one in the U.S. with corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, alfalfa, potatoes, and there's all kinds more. If that sounds confusing, I've accomplished my purpose. It is confusing. There's all kinds of stuff. It's very much chaotic, except it's bloody important because it's working its way through to us. Many companies are developing their own processes. Unilever says it wants to source 100% from things sustainable by the year 2020. And we're not sure where they're going. They've introduced an 89-page form on this. I haven't seen it in Ontario, but apparently they took it to Western Canada, the canola industry. I got a copy of that. I know my farm wouldn't even come close to making that one. The farmers there balked about it. We're gathering some of the farmers in Europe are balking on this thing as well. But when 10% of the whole world market run company says that this is important, you know that things are going to move. Many retailers in Europe, North America are following. I see McDonald's have announced fairly recently that they're going to move to making sure that all of their beef supply source, I forget by the year, I think it's about 2018, is going to be sustainable, whatever that is. Walmart have made a similar announcement. Walmart just said something about 3 weeks ago that they were going to be a major player in stopping the amount of nitrogen that's going down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. And you know who that means? That means grain farmers, livestock industry, and you can be fairly certain if they do something like that south of the border, they're going to do it. Ours doesn't go down the Mississippi, and we got others. I used this example, I got this from Farm and Food Care, Burnbrae Farms, into certification to show you what kind of is happening. This is a major egg producer. They already fill out 7 certification forms every year at $1,500 a piece. The same guy comes in and does every one of them, one after the other, and that's where we're headed. So there are some Canadian initiatives on this thing. AGM, canola, they are already certifying canola that's going into their Lloydminster plant. Not all of it, but a dedicated supply of what they're shipping over to Europe for biofuels. McCain's is actually a good news story because it actually involves you guys. McCain's won a competition for McDonald's for certification standards for French fries all over the world. McCain's don't use any Ontario potatoes for this. They're from the Maritimes and from Manitoba. But they decided, I'm picking this up from what Harold supplied me, they decided that the best base for their certification program was the Environmental Farm Plan that started here. They've added some other stuff. They've added a pesticide component onto it and something on safety. So that's now being used as a basis for certifying potatoes from McCain's, from McDonald's, everywhere. They say in North America it's not too tough, but in India, with literally a myriad of small farmers, they're having the problems. Well, I'd say within the grain sector, Pulse Canada, which theoretically involves me because I'm a bean grower, but it's mostly the lentils and pea folks in Western Canada, has been moving ahead trying to match a program in the United States that I'd like to spend time talking about, but I won't, because I think some of the other stuff may be more significant. They recently formed a Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. It's chaired by, that says Grains Canada, it should be the Canada Grains Council. Grain farmers are part of that. Cargill's part of it. The Canadian grain industry collectively is trying to sort out just how they respond to some of this. The food processors are doing a pretty good job. The Alliance of Ontario Food Processors, Steve Peters now heads that group, and they have a spin-off group called the Provision Alliance. And if you Google that, Provision Alliance, you'll see that they've actually in the last year have moved fairly aggressively to some kind of a process anyway, so people can get information about sustainability, the standards. They're moving to a process that you can take your food company and see how well it's doing. More on there than I would like in one slide, but hopefully you can see that. Some of the initiatives. One of the best one that's going on is the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association and Harold Rudy. When I got interested in this, about more than a year ago, the phone rang one day and it was Harold phoning up because he'd seen something I'd been quoted on in the paper, and I found out Harold was already about a year ahead of me and your organization, quite frankly, looking at what you can do with environmental farm plans to move on and pick up some of the other stuff on sustainability. And there are some major changes. There are some things in sustainability that we don't capture in the environmental farms, like greenhouse gas emissions, environmental or economic sustainability, social sustainability, and so on. And also the confidentiality problem is a problem when you want to make it clear to a buyer that these are the standards and you're meeting them. But it's a really good base. Harold and your group has got George Morris Center to do a study on this. Quite frankly, it's the best initiative that I know of in the farm community that's going on in Ontario, and I applaud you for that. Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association are taking a serious look at that. They've had a George Morris study on that. Farm and Food Care is taking a lot of look at that, especially in particular in the livestock sector. And the livestock sector probably have bigger pressures in this area than crop sector because of animal welfare. Grain Farmers of Ontario hired Nick Betts. I'm amazed how this guy went from a standing start from when he started, about 6 months ago, of really knowing what's going on. I see that the canola growers in Ontario had Nick to speak at their meeting not too long ago, and interesting, if you're looking for a good speaker in this area, Nick would be a good guy. He's been to Europe and knowledgeable what's going. Claudia Smith from the George Morris Center knows this area pretty well, and of course Harold. So there's some others, Sustain Ontario, Local Food Plus. These are more Toronto area GTA groups that have an effort in that. A lot of universities are trying to move into this. I would say some of them in an effective area and some I'm wondering about. And the question, of course, is even an Ontario approach, if this is something being driven by the world's giants, the Unilevers, the Walmart, does it make any difference what we do here in Ontario? But you could have said the same thing on environmental farm plans. Does it make any difference what we do in Ontario? And you started something here in Ontario, now it becomes a national and international leadership. So there's some possibility in there. And but that's some of the questions that are going on. A lot of concerns. I'm sure you could have come up with this list from listening to me now, if you're still listening to me. All kinds of different requirements, coalition, certification. It sounds like a jungle, it is, except it's fairly clear that out of this thing, there are going to become some major standards. And I'm pretty sure it's the Walmart types that are going to take the lead on this sort of stuff. And the way it works, the giants, the Walmart's, the biggest food retailer in North America, is going to take the lead on this. And then the Loblaws and the Sobeys and so on have got to play catch up or play that game. So then it moves down to the food processors, and then it moves down to us. And lots of confusion, more need for more farm input. There's a real sustainability versus greenwashing, one-upsmanship and marketing going on. And then there's, you think that last question is probably the first one I should have asked. What is agriculture sustainability? And that's not even defined very well. We've got the Bruntland definition, we've got the environmental, social, economic. One of the critical things out of this is it has to be a strategy that feeds 9 billion people or more in that neighborhood. One of the problems was sustainability should have never ever, or sustainable should have never been an absolute term, because it's a relative thing. If you sit down, there is absolutely nothing you can figure out in agriculture. You're not going to use some non-renewable resource to some degree. So it has to be a relative thing. The people that are pushing organic, low input, low output, they have some pluses. We know that. In fact, they spend their time, I just went to their conference in Guelph on the weekend, they're spending talking about how building up soil, organic matter, and cover crops and rotations. 90% of what they're talking about is the same stuff you're talking about here. So there are a lot of things in common, except the idea that being driven by low input can't be the driver, and if you're going to have low-cost food for a large number of people, it has to include advanced technology, GMOs, and so on. There are some people that think that it's us cutting back and shipping all cheap grain to the third world, and I could give a whole talk on that, as how opposed I am to that concept. The strategy for sustainability of the third world is growing their own food, not getting cheap stuff coming in from us. And of course that means biofuels, bioproducts, all of those fits into it. I'm just about done, but a few thoughts about this. It is sustainable. One thing I've learned about sustainability is it's sustainable. It's not going anywhere. I tried to dismiss it 15 years ago, thought it was gone, and that's not the case. It's not going to go away, it's going to be grown. Food retailers are being driven by public consumer pressures. Give some credit to the NGOs, whether they like it or not. Those guys have learning how to do their job. They used to run up flagpoles and have demonstrations. Now they put on three-piece suits and go into corporate boardrooms and corporate play. Walmart has a full-time person from the Environmental Defense Fund right in Bentonville, Arkansas. And I don't know any farm groups that got anybody full-time working there. And I can't say anything plus or minus about Environmental Defense Fund, because I honestly don't know enough about them. But that's the sort of things that are going on. And I think it'll build. If you read the media the last 5 years about agriculture, it's all been full of concerns about the world's going to starve to death. We don't have enough food, high prices, all this sort of stuff. Can we grow enough food? I'm old enough to remember when that happened before, 1973. And we went through, in fact, it's remarkably similar pattern. And it fell off the table then, and I'm of the view that that's happening right now, not just me. So when the media start talking about are we going to have enough food, and they start having stories about surplus food and low prices and depressed farm income and everything else, then I suspect we're going to see the more pressure on the sustainability yet rather than less. They do really need input from us. They don't have a clue about farming. They don't have a clue about a lot of things. One of the things we learned when we asked Loblaws what they thought of the Environmental Farm Plan, they said they'd never heard of it. And I know we've had trouble doing that. We haven't done a very good job of telling others what we're doing and interact. They're receptive to it, but they're not going to sit back and wait for anything to happen, because they've already got people coming into their offices telling them what sustainable agriculture already is. And collectively, we've got to figure out a way to do that. We can either lead or be led. Finally, I just wanted to thank some individuals that I think have doing a fabulous job in this area and have contributed dramatically to what I've said. Harold Rudy, Sharon Meriwether, she's the person leading the charge of this Provision Coalition. She was with the Alliance of Food Processors. She was actually with the George Morris Center. She's been around for a while. She's fabulous. Nick Betts, I've already mentioned, doing a great job. Claudia Schmidt from the George Morris Center. Claudia has one huge advantage. She speaks German. And a lot of us leaders, what's happening at the moment is in Germany, and I've encouraged her to take advantage of that, and she's doing a great job. Crystal Mackay, Bruce Kelly are taking major leads on this, farm and food care, OF and VGA. gourd surgeon, or Gord seems to have his hand in just about anything good that happens in agriculture these days, and he's been a good player. So Ontario agriculture really does have a solid core of industry leaders, which is the biggest asset. But I am convinced that this is the biggest issue. In fact, I've been going to some farm meetings. I went down to the fabulous Ridgetown Conference, gets better and better every year. I went to Farm Smart at Guelph, listening to that. Farmers talking about innovation, new ideas, new equipment, and everything else. And I see that driver coming down. And I see this kind of driver coming down with the Walmart and stuff coming down and dictating. And somehow those two are operating on different planets at the moment. But at some stage, this is going to come together. And I think same thing. We can either lead or be led. And I'm finished. Thanks. We're out of here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Terry. Does anybody have a question for Terry? We can take about 6.2 seconds for a question.
Scared him off. Oh, yeah.
Just wondering if you could give us a couple of examples of how we can, because the consumer and the processors are going to want to do this, so we'll find a way to do that. How can we? And also, the traceability to me is really needs to the liability falls on the guy that these lawyers.
Well, I think how do you do this thing? The question is, what can you do provincially and what can you do nationally? Nationally is better. Sometimes provincially is doable nationally. Over the years when I was with the corn producers, I figured out how to get things done provincially. I never was good at figuring out how to do things nationally because it gets more complicated, but I think we work together. But I think it brings some strengths. It brings strengths. What does OSCIA bring to the table? You bring the best knowledge of anybody of actually what happens in the farm, the soil dynamics. You bring the Ontario the farm plans and so on along that line. So then you add farm and food care. What do they bring? Fabulous skills in communication, what you need. Get this through to every place else. You need the commodity groups involved in this sort of stuff. And I think you can do it. Pushing together. I can't say that I can assure success on that sort of stuff, but what's plan B if you don't do that? Then you can be sure it's going to come from activists in a boardroom that are going to be dictating that sort of stuff. And my impression, I haven't done a lot of this personally, but when I talk to Farm and Food Care, when they walk into the boardroom of a major player, Tim Hortons is one they've spent a lot of time with of late. Sobeys they've spent a lot of time with. They get a good reception. They're open to discuss. You just simply have to make the effort to get in there and tell your story. And as far as the traceability thing, it's the livestock people have got lots of experience in that. We don't have a whole lot on that other than specialty crops like IP soybeans, white beans, and things along that line. My guess is we're going to see more of that. And I know in my case in white beans, I get annoyed every time I fill in the contract from Thompson's. They ask more and more questions. And one side of me is ticked off that I have to answer that. And then I gather that the game that they're in, they're trying to be able to move those beans into Heinz, into Britain against all kinds of other suppliers. And I would say all it takes is my part to spend some time filling in that form and being a little bit more careful. I guess maybe that's going to be part of the cost of doing business down the road. But that is the struggles. You ask the American farmers, how come you're not keen on this? And they say, we're not sure who's going to pay for this. And that's a struggle. You ask the British farmers, who I have a fair amount of contact, and to some degree with the French. I'm not fluent in French, but I can struggle by in it. And saying they're asking the same questions. And Claudius found out that the German farmers are asking the same questions. At the same time, we only basically have one outlet for selling food, and that's through some of those larger retailers. And so come back to the same. I know it's a trite bumper sticker type of an answer, but you either lead or be led. I don't think I answered your question at all, but I talked around it. All right. I used up the 6.5 seconds.